Hello, everybody. It's Tuesday, March 4th, 2025. The bad news is that the American dream seems to be in trouble, very much conceptualized or captured by the Statue of Liberty just outside New York, just on the southern tip of Manhattan. It's been in trouble for a while. A couple of years ago, we did a show with David Leonhardt on the decline of the American dream. Leonhardt is the author of Ours Was the Shining Future, the story of the American dream, and also a well-known economics columnist at the New York Times. And then a couple of weeks ago, we did a show with another prominent American journalist, Yoni Applebaum at The Atlantic, a senior editor there. He has a new book out, Stuck: How the Privileged and Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. And both Applebaum and Leonhardt agree that the American dream is in crisis. It may have disappeared entirely. My guest today has a new book out today. It's called Reinventing the Heartland: How One City's Inclusive Approach to Innovation and Growth Can Revive the American Dream. It's by Nicholas Lalla, and he is joining us from New York City, of all places. Nick, congratulations on the new book. Before we get to the book, what is your analysis of the current state of the American dream? Is it still alive? Is it on death row? Has it died?
That's a tough question to lead off. I think that the American dream is alive and well in a select few and very privileged communities on the coasts. And I think that it needs to be resurrected in a more serious and concerted way in particular geographies, the American heartland in particular. I think that what we have seen over the past 10 years or so, maybe dating back to the Great Recession, is two things. One, widespread economic uncertainty and anxiety about the basics. It goes well beyond, I think, the cost of eggs, right, which has become a symbol in recent months. Widespread economic uncertainty in parallel to increasing innovation, wealth creation, in a handful of big coastal tech hubs. And what we've seen, I think, is a divide amongst Americans on multiple different dimensions. Certainly the urban and the rural, certainly the coast and the heartland, obviously blue versus red, which plays into the former two categories, and the elites and basically everyone else. And so, to diagnose the state of the American dream is really tough. You obviously you mentioned some authors at the top of the show.
I assume you've read Leonhardt's book and you're at least familiar with Yoni Applebaum's new book. It certainly touches on a lot of the themes in your new book, Reinventing the Heartland. I should have asked you this question, Nick, actually, before even determining the state of the American dream. You say it's in crisis. I think some of the research shows that Boston, San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, and San Diego, the coastal hubs you're talking about, account for 90% of the nation's innovation sector growth. This was between 2005 and 2017. That's Brookings research. But before we even get there, what exactly is the American dream?
I think in broad strokes, and I was going to throw the Harvard economist Raj Chetty into the conversation amongst the other authors that you mentioned. I think in broad strokes, it's the ability to do better than your parents, to lead a good and decent life, to have relative financial security so that successive generations are better off, that you're doing better than your parents and you're positioning your children to do better than you. According to Chetty's research, others, that fundamental bargain that I think has fueled American society for the past couple hundred years, I think is fading, right? There's a 50-50 shot that you're going to do better than your parents now, and that is probably less if you are a woman, less if you're a person of color, less if you live in rural communities, less if you live outside of the coasts, right? And so if you're living in San Diego and you're a techie and you're a software engineer making really good money, you might think that the American dream is alive and well in your little bubble, right? If you are in Northeast Oklahoma and concerned about the volatility in the energy industry and want to transition to tech, but don't find available upskilling opportunities to pursue that dream, you might have a different level of anxiety. You might have a different level of pessimism about your own future and the country's trajectory.
Nick, your definition is a good one, right? By the way, Raj Shetty, I never had him on the show, but David Leonhardt in his book, Ours Was the Shining Future, spends a lot of time discussing and referring to his work. He's a prominent economist. This idea of doing better than your parents as an excuse for a brief bio. Have you done better than your parents? What did your parents do? And where did you grow up?
I was born and raised in New Orleans to a working class family. Was raised by a single mom who never completed college. In a lot of respects, in traditional indicators, I've done far better than my mother has, than my family has. And my mom leads a good and decent life in southeastern Louisiana, but I have been privileged to get elite education. I've been privileged to have great career opportunities, founded my own organization, writing a book, published a book. And so by traditional metrics, I'm doing much better than my parents. I worked exceptionally hard, got great education, had a loving mother that provided for me and my brother, and have had access to the very best education on the planet. That is, in a lot of ways, a really challenging set of positive attributes that are hard to replicate, right? And I think what we're seeing in communities, particularly in the heartland, is that having good parents isn't sufficient, that there is economic anxiety occurring in rural communities and mid-sized communities throughout the country, where kids don't get a good education. Kids don't have parents that can provide for them, meet basic needs. They don't see in their own communities tech jobs, entrepreneurs. Those careers are foreign to a lot of places. And I think that's why building inclusive innovation economies, providing folks the opportunity to get a good job in tech, I think is going to be a prerequisite in broad strokes to the American dream in this generation and in successive generations. If you don't have core tech skills, if you're not working for a tech company, if you're not able to create your own business and innovate, I think you're going to be increasingly on the margins of society and economically isolated from where the bulk of the country's industry is at.
It's interesting. I never really thought about this before, Nick, but thinking out loud, doing better than your parents. Your mother must have a great deal of admiration for you. As you said, you went to some of the best schools. You've done incredibly well. You're the founder of Tulsa Innovation Labs, which is very much bound up in the narrative of the new book. When you don't do better than your parents, do you think parents feel sorry for you? Or how does that change the relationship between parents and children?
That's a great question. I think a few things. I forget the particular movie, but there's this old movie in which this rich guy says that he kind of graduated college with $8 million in the bank and he's never been able to get ahead, right? And so I think that if you are coming from the upper middle class, it's a totally different story. But I think what so sobering to me is, having come from a highly diverse working class neighborhood in New Orleans, to see the generational effects on families, on communities, on the built environment, on places, when children don't do better than your parents, when you have a cycle of poverty in particular, right? And I think it does a few things. One is it certainly breaks the hearts of parents to see their children experience the same challenges that they did growing up and not being able to get ahead, falling into the same traps of drug abuse, of crime, of addiction, etc.
Deaths of Despair that Angus Deaton so famously and his wife Anne Case wrote about. He was on the show a few years ago.
Yeah, exactly. That must be heartbreaking. And what I think it does is it breeds, I think in legitimate ways, a cynicism and pessimism about American democracy and American capitalism. To know that systems and structures, from the tax scheme to governmental systems to the education system, are not meeting communities' needs, that they're stacked against too many communities, and you have in parallel an alternate universe where San Francisco and New York continue to generate millionaires by the day. And I think that disparity in income inequality, in the American dream, which Chetty's data, bears out, I think is so sobering. I think that's why you have widespread pessimism in the country that has ushered into non-consecutive terms of Donald Trump, right?
Yeah, I don't want to turn this into another Trump conversation. He gets enough press anyway.
That's totally fair.
Everywhere, and even on this show. But I think it's implied from what you're saying. The book is called, Nick, Reinventing the Heartland. This theme of redistributing wealth and innovation and investment around America is not new. Steve Case, the founder of AOL, has dedicated his post-AOL life to it. What are you doing or saying that hasn't been said before in Reinventing the Heartland?
Yeah, also good question. I don't necessarily think that, I mean, in some ways I'm making a, redistributive argument, right? I frame it this way. I frame it as the American innovation system needs to be decentralized away from New York and San Francisco as two coastal poles, right? And like Steve Case believes that there's enormous untapped potential in the middle of the country. I'm certainly for a place-based approach to economic development. I think the kind of federal policy shift that President Biden ushered in was sound. I think something like President Trump's opportunity zones is a conservative bent on a similar objective. What I'm saying is it's less redistributing wealth or capital or tech jobs or innovation, and more, cities need to invest in themselves. I think that we've fallen into this trap of believing the myth of Silicon Valley, that only Silicon Valley and the Bay Area can be a tech hub, that's the model, right? I fundamentally don't think that it's the model. It's not a model because you can't replicate Silicon Valley. You're never going to have anywhere else on the planet the concentration of venture capital, of startups, of tech talent, of Stanford University, of the University of California, Berkeley. And to me, any city that tries to emulate Silicon Valley as the model is foolish and setting themselves up for failure. So it's less about redistributing capital. It's less about emulating Silicon Valley, and more in building on local strengths. And so the organizing structure of my book, Reinventing the Heartland, is an action plan for urban reinvention. I fundamentally believe that every city in America can and should become a tech hub. And it's not about emulating Silicon Valley. It's building on their strengths. It's finding their tech niche, right? mid-sized cities like Tulsa, Oklahoma don't need to compete with New York or Boston or San Diego. They need to be the best version of themselves. And to me, that requires cities to find their tech niche. How do you build on your legacy industries? How do you build a bridge to emerging technology clusters? How do you find emerging tech sectors that offer a range of jobs attainable across education levels? How do you find specific clusters or subclusters or parts of a value chain in which your city can lead? And so it's not about competing with New York. It's not about emulating Silicon Valley. It's not about thinking that you're going to be the heartland, the capital of the heartland, right? It's about building a tech hub that's right-sized and tailor-made to your community.
Do you think Steve Case made a little bit of error in terms of how he described his vision of creating alternatives to Silicon Valley dotted around the US? Is that a sort of implicit criticism of people like Case?
No, it's not an implicit criticism of Case, and I don't know if Case used the word alternative to Silicon Valley. To me, I think tech and innovation is big enough where every city can participate in the tech economy. To me, the fallacy again is, and this is less on Steve Case and more cities that kind of believe in the Silicon Valley mythology. You hear, Silicon Prairie or Silicon Heartland. That drives me crazy, right? Because
although often it's not the cities, that it's journalists who choose the terms.
Well, that might be true. I've seen my fair share of kind of civic organizations leading and branding their cities, their initiatives in that way.
Yeah, you had an interesting piece about why cities need effective troublemakers. Does everybody need a Nick Lalla? I mean, you're in a sense an effective troublemaker for Tulsa. We'll talk about what you did there in a few minutes in terms of the book. But does every city need, and this is a kind of a Silicon Valley term, an effective troublemaker, a disruptor?
Yeah, well, they certainly, God help them if every city had a Nick Lalla. But I do think that every city needs a good and effective troublemaker. Yes, I think we talk about DC and New York and California as bubbles, but mid-sized cities are bubbles too. Tulsa, Oklahoma is a bubble, particularly when you don't have a transient population. The status quo becomes entrenched, right? Particularly at the civic class, where there's close familiarity. And so to me, you don't need to hire Nick per se, but you need to embrace and support and empower leaders, particularly young and diverse leaders, who can see cities from the outside in, who can take a step back, see systems for what they are, identify gaps and flaws, and build a shared vision for growth that brings the community together. I found and have found in my experience working with cities that when you're dealing with civic leaders that have been in the job 20 or 30 years, that there is a resistance to change, that there is a groupthink that sets in, that there is a lack of risk taking, and blind spots exist even in cities with strong communities, right? And so having somebody who can take a step back, disrupt the status quo, and chart a new path forward, and importantly, bring the community along with them, I do think is a necessary component to what I call urban reinvention.
Nick, we had Tim Wu on the show recently, very prominent antitrust lawyer in the Biden administration, who had an interesting piece recently, The Real Road to Serfdom in Liberties, about decentralizing capitalism. It's a different piece and different thinking from you, but you're also in the business of decentralizing capitalism, aren't you? You're not looking for government handouts here. You're looking at innovation from places like Tulsa.
Yeah, and I fundamentally believe that this isn't. I think capitalism is working for some communities and not others. I think we're seeing increasing economic isolation across geographies, across races, across classes. I don't think that this is a problem that only government can solve, but I do think that there are policy tools, place-based economic development, the tax system that can reform capitalism, decentralize it, empower communities to enter the 21st century. But fundamentally, and what I find so admiring about Tulsa, Oklahoma, is that they didn't wait for the government to write them a check. This started at the local level, particularly the philanthropic sector.
So let's focus then on Tulsa. This is the core of your book, Reinventing the Heartland: How One City's Inclusive Approach to Innovation and Growth Can Revive the American Dream. What has been done in Tulsa and is associated with your Tulsa Innovation Labs, which you founded? What happened in Tulsa? It's something I have to admit I'm not that familiar. It hasn't had a great deal of press, but what has Tulsa achieved that you think can be emulated elsewhere?
Yeah, I think what Tulsa has achieved is created a community-centric and shared vision for growth that they have, over the past 5 years, made concerted, intentional, and thoughtful investments in their own community. And they've done it in a comprehensive way. They've done it in a strategic way, thanks to Tulsa Innovation Labs. And what they have done is essentially course corrected their economy. When I first entered the picture 5, 6 years ago, this is how it was kind of explained to me, that local civic leaders, corporate leaders in particular, essentially had a come to Jesus moment with George Kaiser, the founder of the George Kaiser Family Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar philanthropy serving Northeast Oklahoma, and said, look, we're lagging, Tulsa, Oklahoma is lagging behind regional peers, brain drain, post-industrialism, increased volatility in the oil and gas market industry. And if we don't do something different, we're going to get left behind as a community. Our youngest and our brightest are going to leave.
Yeah, you keep on talking about Northeast
Oklahoma.
That's essentially Tulsa, right? Or it's certainly where Tulsa is.
That's exactly right, yeah. And so what happened was a few things in quick succession. One, right before the pandemic, I think a year or two before the pandemic actually, they launched an initiative called Tulsa Remote, which is a famous kind of, it went viral, a $10,000 incentive to attract folks, particularly in tech, to come to Tulsa and live there for a year. Wildly successful, thousands of applications, high retention rates, enormous impact on the local tax base. And then they recruited me to lead tech-led economic development. And rather than take a scattershot approach to economic development, my pitch was, let's find Tulsa's tech niche. Let's find those handful of emerging tech clusters that represent the strongest opportunities for growth. Let's raise a lot of money and invest in those sectors to grow jobs. And so that's what we did. We launched Tulsa Innovation Labs, invested in virtual health, energy tech, advanced air mobility, and cyber. You have other initiatives come online, Build in Tulsa to support Black entrepreneurs, the Atlas School, a coding boot camp, et cetera. In addition to that, you have serious investments in quality of place, a $500 million urban park called the Gathering Place. And so you have all of these mega investments happening at one time, and Tulsa Innovation Labs really leading the charge on course correcting the economy. How do you transition from an oil and gas dominated economy, which is seeing increased volatility because of climate change, renewables, digitization, et cetera? How do you transition that regional economy to tech? And what we did was we started with our philanthropic backer, but we raised $30-something million from our corporate partners, and we raised $80 million from the federal government. And so we raised $200 million in 4 years to invest in those emerging tech areas. That, I think, is inspirational because the only thing that's really unique about Tulsa is that it's putting its money where its mouth is. I speak with cities all the time. Everybody wants to become a tech hub. Nobody has the political will or the capital. Excuse me, they have the capital. They're not spending it in the right ways. And what Tulsa is doing is they're actually doing it. They're doing the hard work. It's messy, it's complicated, it's not perfect, but we're on track to grow 20,000 tech jobs over the next decade.
How has that changed the politics? You touched on Trump and populism earlier. Has that changed the politics of Oklahoma? We don't hear that much about it, but have you seen that permeate the politics and culture of Tulsa? Is Tulsa perhaps a more inclusive, tolerant place than other medium-sized towns in America?
I think it's definitely more diverse and more inclusive than most people think it is. I think that there is probably a justifiably negative perception of the state of Oklahoma on issues of inclusion, a very troubled racial past with respect to indigenous communities.
Right, and of course the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa, which is amongst other race massacres, it's probably the best known.
Exactly. So there is troubled history, and I'm from Louisiana, so we have our own set of issues too. But Tulsa is majority minority. There's a strong philanthropic community, strong community service. There is kind of a libertarian streak to the city. I'm a gay New Yorker that moved to Tulsa several years ago and was warmly welcomed. At the same time, to your question, and this is not without controversy, particularly through the Tulsa Remote Initiative, these investments are changing the demographics of the region. There's no doubt about that. There has been an influx of younger, more diverse, more educated, probably more progressive residents. And that change has been disruptive. I recount this kind of quick anecdote in the book, but there was a state legislator that essentially accused the initiative of importing liberals into Tulsa, right? And you have the question of, why are we incentivizing these outsiders to come to Tulsa when we're not investing in Tulsans themselves? That I think is a very healthy conversation to be having, and part of the kind of the change management and kind of part of the reinvention process itself that communities have to go through as neighborhoods change, as gentrification potentially happens. That's why the municipal government is going to need to offset some of that with increased affordable housing, et cetera. But yeah, some of those demographic changes are happening. They're certainly a topic of conversation, but I think Tulsa is handling it really quite well because Tulsa Remoters in this example are contributing a lot to the city, and there have been major investments in education, in workforce development in particular for Tulsans as well. So I think that the community overall is benefiting from these investments.
As I said, Yoni Applebaum talks about in Stuck about real estate and the fact that nobody's moving anymore. But I think your thesis is some people are moving. There's the rise of mid-sized American cities. More and more millennials are flocking to smaller cities. So we're already seeing this outside Tulsa. Tulsa's the model, of course, but are you seeing it elsewhere in America, Nick?
Yeah, I think a few things. Certainly, the pandemic accelerated the kind of remote workforce trend, threw into relief that even big coastal cities were too expensive and folks were being priced out. Even well-compensated talent in San Francisco and New York were being priced out, that it's becoming increasingly risky to become an entrepreneur in very expensive cities, right? And so the pandemic threw all of these things together and showed people that there are a ton of mid-sized cities, unassuming places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, that offer higher quality of life, lower cost of living, that people can pursue their dreams. And the pandemic allowed folks to see that. And Tulsa, I think, has done a really good job of capturing a large share of remote workers. You've seen some fluctuations in big city populations post-pandemic. You've seen kind of a backlash to remote work, folks wanting people to go back into the office. But I think the fundamental structure isn't changing, which is that big cities still have a dominance on talent. But you are starting to see the value proposition for mid-sized cities to becoming more robust and clear, and cities are working harder to incentivize people to come to their towns. Tulsa's population continues to increase. Tulsa Remote as an incentive program continues to get thousands and thousands of applications for very few slots. And you've seen
What exactly, you've mentioned that a couple of times. What is Tulsa Remote?
So Tulsa Remote is a remote work incentive program, and it's very simple and very easily replicable. The basics is we will pay you $10,000 to come and live in Tulsa for 1 year. That's it. And because there are finite slots, the program can pick the strongest applicants.
So how many people apply and how many places are there?
Oh, I forget the statistics off the top of my head, but I want to say like there's 10,000 slots, or there's 10,000 applicants for like 100 or 200 slots, but don't quote me on that. But it is highly competitive. And so what they do is they look for folks that can contribute to the economy, and folks who can contribute to the community through community service.
Finally, Nick,
yeah.
How many people watching this, and they might be kind of intrigued? They'll be living in New York and San Francisco or Los Angeles, struggling a bit. Rents are very high. Restaurants are expensive. Food's expensive. But they'll say, I don't want to go to Tulsa. There's nothing going on there. There's no Broadway. There's no beautiful Pacific views. How would you respond to people who say the heartland's boring? I don't want to go to Oklahoma. I don't want to go to Arkansas. I don't want to go to Missouri. I don't want to go to Kansas. I want to stay on the coast, or maybe I'll go to Chicago. Why would people really want to risk their lives in the heartland?
Well, I mean, look, I would say that if you put a premium on going to theater, then you might not want to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's A-okay, right? If you put a premium on biking, on tubing, on outdoor activities, then I think places like Bentonville, Arkansas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma should be very high on your list. If you put a premium on owning a home, on having space, on having land, you should come to Tulsa, Oklahoma. I think that if you want to build a community of entrepreneurs, if you want to be part of something bigger than yourself, if you want to be in a city in the midst of really exciting change, and if you want to feel that change and participate in it on a daily basis, and walk down the street and run into an entrepreneur, run into a founder, run into an investor, if you want to take part in those meetups, then come to Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you want to build a company, particularly in the virtual health, energy tech, or advanced air mobility spaces, you should come to Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you're looking for support services to grow your business, you should come to Tulsa.
Well, there you have it. The American dream and the Statue of Liberty may still exist, at least according to Nick Lalla, his book, Reinventing the Heartland, How One City's Inclusive Approach to Innovation and Growth Can Revive the American Dream, is out today. Congratulations, Nick, and congratulations on the work. It's an important argument, and I think the future of America really does rest on reinventing the heartland. So thank you so much for appearing on Keen on America. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me, and thank you